I'm happy to welcome you to this lunchtime session of this impressive first ever Oversight Summit. My name is Bob Ackerman. I'm a professor of law at Wayne State University and director of the Levin Center at Wayne Law, which is located in Detroit, Michigan at Wayne State, and which also has a presence here in D.C. through our two Washington co-directors, Elise Bean and Linda Gustitis. The Levin Center is pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of this summit. Thank you to POGO, to our host, PPS, and their excellent staffs for pulling this day-long event together. The Levin Center has, as one of its principal missions, promoting and improving legislative oversight at all levels of government. That's because the center was created in honor of the impressive career and good work of Senator Carl Levin, who for 36 years represented the state of Michigan and made fact-based bipartisan oversight one of his priorities. Today, Senator Levin will be presenting the inaugural Carl Levin Award for Effective Oversight to South Carolina State Representative Weston Newton. Following that presentation, Macaulay Carr, General Counsel of the House Ways and Means Committee, will moderate a conversation with Senator Levin and Representative Newton on the how-tos of legislative oversight and why each made, as part of his oversight work, a commitment to bipartisanship and fact-finding. So let me briefly introduce Senator Levin. Senator Levin served for 36 years on the Armed Services Committee, where he served as both committee chair and ranking member, and for 36 years on the Governmental Affairs Committee, now known as Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, where he chaired or was ranking member of several oversight subcommittees, including some 15 years on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. In these roles, he led investigations into everything from the Social Security Disability Program to defense procurement to lobbying disclosure, IRS seizure policy, Enron, money laundering, tax evasion, and the 2008 financial crisis. He operated throughout that period with a commitment to bipartisanship and the facts, the result of which has meant the vast majority of his findings, recommendations, and investigative reports were supported by members from both sides of the aisle. Senator Levin retired from the Senate in 2015. He now lives in Detroit, where he heads the Levin Center, teaches at Wayne Law, and serves as senior counsel at the Honigman Law Firm. We are grateful that he could be here today to present this award. Senator Levin.
Thank you so much, Bob, for the introduction, for all the work you do at the law school in Detroit at Wayne, and for your work with the Levin Center. And I want to, of course, thank POGO and all the organizations that are involved in putting on today's forum. You've done a terrific job of doing this. It comes at a truly critical time for this subject in this country, in this nation. So your timing couldn't be better. I want to also add my thanks to Linda Gustitis, who is our co-director of the Levin Center office here in Washington with Elise Bean. She's been with me for a lot longer than she looks. When we created the Levin Center at Wayne Law, we wanted to focus on the value of bipartisan legislative oversight. And when we say legislative oversight, we mean not only oversight conducted by Congress, but also the oversight that does or should occur within state legislatures and other local legislative bodies. In other words, elected officials at all levels should be doing a lot more oversight than is currently going on. We took that multi-level approach because we were convinced that literally good government requires that there be effective, aggressive, and good oversight. One way to encourage good oversight, we decided, is to recognize the individuals who are in the trenches, who are doing high-quality, fact-based, bipartisan oversight day in and day out, leading the way for their fellow elected officials to conduct meaningful inquiries, resulting in real reforms for the public good. To identify those oversight leaders, we decided to create and issue an award. We began taking nominations for this award in January of this year. Our selection committee included Levin Center staff, board members, and Wayne Law faculty, as well as outside experts in the field of oversight who helped us to identify and to evaluate the nominees. To be selected for the award, a candidate must be or have been a member of a legislative body at the national or local level and played a central role in the bipartisan conduct of an oversight, one or more oversight investigations. In addition, the candidate must have demonstrated an exceptional commitment to fact-finding and exhibited a high degree of integrity and commitment to legislative comedy. That's ITY, by the way. I'm delighted today to announce that South Carolina State Representative Weston Newton from Bluffton, South Carolina, has surely met all of those criteria and has been chosen to receive the inaugural Carl Levin Award for Effective Oversight. Representative Newton, before we call you up here to give you this award, I'd like to embarrass you a bit and read what the Speaker of the South Carolina House, Jay Lucas, said about Representative Newton's work when he nominated Representative Newton for the award. And here's what the Speaker had to say. In 2014 and 2016, Weston Newton was unanimously elected by 19 colleagues as the chair of the South Carolina House Legislative Oversight Committee. Under his leadership, the oversight of agencies is objective. Committee members are afforded ample opportunities to ask questions and obtain information about agencies under review. Weston has directed staff to assist any member of the House with matters relating to oversight. As chair, Weston determines the number and the size of subcommittees and appoints subcommittee chairs. 4 of the 5 subcommittees have equal representation from the majority and minority parties. Under Weston's leadership, the committee's investigation of agencies is objective and focuses on obtaining factual information. Weston can often be heard during meetings explaining to various agencies that legislative oversight is not a gotcha process. One of Weston's goals for his colleagues is to become confident enough in their knowledge of agency operations to both detect issues, but also to craft useful solutions. Some standardization of the process and the types of reports received have resulted in members becoming more adept at sifting through information, separating fact from fiction. And the letter, the nomination continues. As a lawyer with 25 years of experience, Weston understands the importance of integrity and legislative comedy in the oversight of state agencies. Under his leadership, the committee's rules require it to decline any invitations for meals or similar social events in recognition of the importance for fairness in the legislative oversight process. Weston frequently encourages his colleagues during committee meetings to focus on agency policies and not personalities. All meetings stream online. Documents received from the agency are posted online for the public to view, and roll calls are held on all legislative oversight studies. He is also the primary sponsor of recently enacted legislation enacting South Carolina's Freedom of Information Act. Weston's leadership is evidenced, the nomination goes on, in all phases of the committee's investigation. of the South Carolina Department of Public Safety. The investigation included 14 subcommittee meetings, 3 full committee meetings, and receipt of public input from more than 800 concerned individuals. Outcomes from this study include both legislative and internal changes at the agency. I want to read now very briefly from a couple letters that we've received from Weston's colleagues in the House of Representatives. The first one from, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Lori Funderburk. Did I get that correct? She is the Democratic Vice Chair of the Oversight Committee. And I'll just read the last paragraph, but she says, as a member of the minority party in the House, I can attest to Chairman Newton's bipartisan leadership in seeking to increase the transparency, effectiveness, and accountability of our government. Chairman Newton is unwavering in his commitment to a fair and open process that shows respect for the input of members of the public, agency staff, and all committee members. And she wanted to extend to you her warmest congratulations on a well-deserved recognition. The other note that we got is from Representative Jefferson, who's a Democrat from, well, you know him, I won't tell you what part of South Carolina he's from, but part of the letter reads as follows, that he's one of 4 subcommittee chairpersons serving on the Oversight Committee and witnesses with astonishment the ability of our great chairman. He is certainly deserving of this wonderful award. Weston is a Republican, but again, his Democratic colleagues on the Oversight Committee with whom we consulted couldn't be more enthusiastic about the appropriateness of Representative Newton receiving this award. So it's my real pleasure to present this award to you, Representative. If you'll come up and stand here with me for a minute. I don't know how your track record could be any better than what we know it to be. It just couldn't be stronger. I've known a lot of people involved in oversight in my career, but this description is as strong as any that I have ever heard of, or read, or experienced myself. And we just want to thank Speaker Lucas for bringing you to our attention. We thank you for your commitment and your conduct of effective, bipartisan, fact-based oversight, which is an example for all legislators across this country, and desperately in need. We desperately need more of this, surely, in our nation's capital. So it's my honor to present you with this award.
Good afternoon. Senator Levin, Director Ackerman, leadership and staff of the Summit and Levin Center, thank you for this prestigious award, which I humbly accept on behalf of our bipartisan group of dedicated House members, our staff, and also on behalf of the best intentions of the South Carolina General Assembly. We are not that familiar with being recognized for positive achievement, but that is certainly but gradually changing. Indulge me a little background. South Carolina state government has historically been dominated by the legislature, the General Assembly. The reasons are interesting, but beyond the scope of this event. In the last several years, we have made considerable effort to ensure that we have a functional executive in the governor, an independent state court system, and a legislature that does legislative things, not just preempt and dominate the other branches. Since the 200-plus agencies, boards, commissions, and departments of the state were often unduly controlled and managed by senior legislators, with attendant ethical challenges, our government reorganization has created some power vacuums in the agencies and departments, hence the need for the Legislative Oversight Committee. We are mandated to do a complete programmatic study of each agency or department at least every 7 years. We compare their enabling legislation to their performance and hold them to a standard of ethical and transparent government that is articulated in the legislation. We constructed the Legislative Oversight Committee to reflect the ethics and transparency we expect from each of our agencies. We live stream and archive all committee and subcommittee meetings. We publish all our activities on the website and vigorously solicit public input on each study subject with an emphasis on employees of the agencies or folks who have business with them. With 27 completed agency studies and investigations behind us, the results have been profoundly astounding. Agency employees want to do their best work. They complain if they are impeded from such by political interference or leadership malfeasance or even simple lack of interest by managers. The General Assembly has been astonished at what the Oversight Committee has accomplished. The most observable tenet of that astonishment is the number of times in debate that the LOC is referenced in favor of one measure or another, and almost always in a positive manner. Suffice it to say that true bipartisan oversight, featuring both ethical rigor and undiluted transparency, has so far been a startling, unexpected success in South Carolina. We are continually striving to improve our process and are full steam forward on completing the studies and investigations on the remaining agencies. I personally have been heartened by the national response to our modest efforts. Again, I thank you for this honor. I can say with confidence that the subject of this conference, considering its reception in South Carolina, can well be a keystone to the necessary reboot of politics and government at all levels. Thank you very much.
So while our panelists are taking their seats, it's my pleasure to introduce Michaela Carr. I promised her I'd pronounce her name correctly at least once today, who is General Counsel and Parliamentarian for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Ways and Means, where she leads investigations and oversight of all issues within the committee's jurisdiction. Prior to joining Ways and Means, she served as the Director of Oversight and Investigations for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and as Senior Oversight Counsel at the Committee on Natural Resources. From 2009 to 2011, Ms. Carr served in the Office of Global Compliance of the energy company Weatherford International, where she conducted internal investigations, audits, and compliance reviews for the company. From 2006 to 2009, she practiced at Sonnenschein Nath and Rosenthal. Ms. Carr has taught trial practice at Catholic University, Columbus School of Law, and I invite her now to, together with Representative Newton and Senator Levin, to engage in a conversation about some of the do's and don'ts of effective oversight, how it's possible to perform effective oversight in today's political climate, and why effective oversight is so important. Michaela?
Thank you so much. I think the best place to start would be with his last question, which is, so both of you have done significant bipartisan oversight work. Why is it so important to hold governments accountable and have the government itself do that oversight work?
The people's business ought to be done in public. And for people to understand and have confidence and support in their government, they need to see what's... to see what's going on. That, the agencies that are created at any level of government are not created for the benefit of the party that's in power. In fact, they're not created for the benefit of any party. They're created for and established for the citizens and the taxpayers and the people that benefit, whether it's social services or roads or garbage or sewer or whatever it is, or the court systems. And when it appears that our agencies at any level are being dominated or controlled in inappropriate ways or to favor one side or the other, or acting outside the bounds for which they were created through a process that involves legislation and the various branches of government, it leads to a mistrust in government. And I think that, in part, is what leads us to the civil discourse that we have today. Whether an agency is doing its job properly or not should not be something that either party has the franchise on asking the questions, and nor should the party in power be afraid to ask the questions and expose the shortcomings of those agencies because of fear of reprisal at subsequent elections.
Anything to add, or a different perspective from the
No, my my perspective is obviously very similar, and I learned early as a local government official in Detroit, where I was on the city council for 8 years before I was elected to the U.S. Senate, just how important it is that programs, particularly that were coming from the federal government, work well. Their purpose can be great, and there were programs that I strongly supported as a local official that were terribly run and did more damage than they did good. And so I learned early that it's important for people who really favor programs in public life to spend a good deal of time, and probably as much time, watching over those programs and making sure that they function properly as they do, and putting them in place to begin with. So that's number one. That's kind of based on experience, and I've seen too many people who favor passionately certain programs, but then move on to other programs and not taking the necessary time and insistence to make sure that what has been put in place is functioning for the people. Secondly, in a democracy, you always have to have people looking at each other skeptically. People naturally, instinctively seek power, want to hold on to power, and too often that leads to abuses of people, by people in power. And so you need checks and balances, and oversight is the greatest check and balance there is, other than perhaps a federal court. But legislative oversight is critically important if you're going to have a government which lives up to the responsibilities of a government in a democratic society. And I would just add briefly that that's always been true. It's been true from the founding of this republic, what I just said, but it's in a way truer now than ever, because I think that democratic government is under real challenges here and around the world. And so it's doubly or triply, or whatever number is appropriate, important that we focus on honest government, a government that has integrity, that speaks the truth, and, as Representative Newton just said, speaks whatever it says openly. Let the others judge the truth of it, but openly. Transparency is such a critical part, and it's been such an important part of his life in South Carolina.
You mentioned that it might be more important now than ever. Can you speak a little to how important it is to make sure that the oversight that's being done is bipartisan? And maybe the second part of that is how to build bipartisanship if it's something that might be perceived at first blush to be something susceptible to a partisan attack.
If oversight is going to affect change, including change in policy, it's got to be bipartisan. It's a fact of life. You can have oversight that is dramatic, and where there's a lot of passion and a lot of output of energy, but which can be useless in terms of affecting change if it's just partisanship. If the purpose of oversight is just to make partisan points, you may or may not succeed. Some of the oversight around this town that has been highly partisan, I don't think has had a particularly even positive political effect for the people who were performing the oversight, but that's maybe a subjective judgment. But it's not going to affect policy. It's not going to affect change and reform. And the oversight which we focused on at the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations was always bipartisan. It didn't make any difference what the philosophical view was of my ranking members. And they may be very, very conservative compared to somebody like me who's a liberal or whatever the current title is. We used to call Midwest progressives. But I was lucky that we established trust and trusted each other, which is the key to everything. So in terms of how do you achieve bipartisan oversight, it starts with the leaders of the Oversight Committee. They've got to trust each other, even if they disagree with each other, by the way. We had great success in coming up with joint reports, joint investigations. Our staffs were always directed to work together and not surprise each other, do our investigations, our depositions, our interviews jointly, always, share every document with each other, go out drinking together, not too often, but once in a while. But it emanated from what they like to do, by the way, and staff really likes to work together, or else they shouldn't be here, because it's not a fun job unless you like to work with the people you're working with. If you're fighting all the time, it's not nearly as much fun. But they were given direction, and this is the key to your second part of your question. How do you establish it? Maybe it's impossible. There may be circumstances where the distrust is so deep going in that you can't really achieve it. But putting that aside, which hopefully doesn't exist too often, if the leaders of whatever the committee is trust each other, and it's very fundamental, just simply trust each other, not surprise each other. And if they make a mistake, apologize, by the way. It's part of trust. And then direct their staff to work together. If you can start with that seed, it will flower. If you don't have that to begin with, it's unlikely to succeed. But that's the essential one word I would say is critical. I was blessed with my ranking members, starting with Bill Cohn, Susan Collins, ended up for many, many years with John McCain of recent blessed memory, and Tom Coburn. And Tom Coburn, Senator Coburn, a very conservative senator. And I worked beautifully together because our direction to staff was a joint direction. Go after the facts and don't worry where they take you. Let the chips fall where they may. And we both believed that. And they could fall on someone of our party or someone we were close to. But that's what you got to start with if you're going to have any success in getting bipartisan oversight.
And how does that differ? You have an entirely nonpartisan staff, and so they have access to everything. Can you talk a little bit about how that process
So
works?
it's the rules that set us up and that I was involved with putting together is complete and unfettered access to the staff, not by the party in power, not by the majority party or the minority party. They are staff of oversight. And they are all lawyers, and the rules provide that there are attorney-client privileges that run by each member of the committee and the member of staff, so that as the investigations are ongoing, if they have lines of inquiry they want explored, they can pursue those with those staff members without any interference from anybody else on the committee. And as Senator Levin said, it's about trust. You know, when we put the committee together, it was explained that everything we do is going to be transparent. We're going to put everything up on the web, that if you didn't want to work in that kind of setting, then this probably wasn't the right committee for you to be in. We're not each entitled to our own separate version of the facts. The facts are the facts, and that's what we're supposed to do is, in a bipartisan way, investigate that and encourage the public to be a part of that and invite them in to the process. And then from that, make a set of recommendations that move forward. Now, how those recommendations get used to develop policy, they may take on partisan direction after that. But getting through our process and through our report, there's no legislation that comes from our committee. We're an investigatory body. And so all we do is issue, I say all we do, is issue a report and recommendation that then becomes a tool for the general public, for the executive branch, and other members of the legislature.
Can you speak to your thoughts on whether there's any value in having some information that is delivered to you or turned over to you that is not turned over to the public? Has there been any downside to, I know you post everything right onto the website there. Has there been any downside to that?
Not yet. I mean, what we have told, I mean, there have been some comments made on the open portal when we start a public agency survey. Comments that are made about individual elected officials that they probably weren't too happy with. But to remedy that, the portal is open for people to make comments about me too. And so we don't sanitize. You know, for us to avoid even an appearance of impropriety, we can't be involved in scrubbing what information the public sees and doesn't see about our process. And so if we begin to decide what information the public is entitled to know or not know about what we're doing, we're already struggling to try to say we do that in a trustworthy way. We're not hiding anything, but it begins to take on, if folks wanted to, ammunition for partisan issues. That, well, it was the Republican committee chairman who received this and didn't allow it to go forward. You know, we tell people when you submit information to us, it's their disclaimers on the website, their disclaimers as part of our survey. Your information is intended to be and will be made public. You can submit it anonymously, but it will be made public.
And now that's a little different from the way that PSI operated. You also had subpoena authority, so that you would be getting things that in many instances would not be made public. And what advice do you have to deal with information that not all of which will be transparent, and how to decide what to turn over and what to include in the report?
In terms of the partisanship, though, side of that question, every document that came in, even if it was kept confidential, which I'll get to in a minute, was obviously shared by all the staff and all the members. So nothing was kept from a member because it was confidential, but was kept from the public because it was confidential. There were a number of things that had to be kept confidential, including proprietary information that might come in from a business, anonymous information. We had one case where somebody testified behind a screen, was kept anonymous as he was actually testifying because of security reasons, I think, in that case. But there will be instances where you just, for perfectly appropriate reasons, just have to keep confidentiality. But that's in terms of a wall between the public, which in some cases just wouldn't be fair if it's, for instance, a personnel file that's under investigation in some way, and you get access to it. You have to keep that confidential. Things that you might get from an agency such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, which they have received in confidence, would have to be kept confidential. In terms of the comment that Representative Newton made about his being an investigating subcommittee and not a legislative committee, the same thing is true with a permanent subcommittee on investigations. But it is also true that a lot of our investigations led to some very significant legislation. And when I mentioned reforms before, that included significant legislation which resulted or was supported or impacted by our investigations, including Dodd-Frank, where we had a critical role in terms of Wall Street abuses, including sweepstakes reform, credit card reform, the reform bill that we did on following Enron, the reforms that followed Enron, which were legislative reforms. We, I think, drafted a significant part of the money laundering piece of Sarbanes-Oxley, for instance, I think was probably drafted by our staff on our subcommittee. So even though investigative subcommittees don't directly have legislative power to draft and propose legislation, I think that you would agree that you can have a real effect on the legislative process and on legislation itself.
Absolutely. In fact, we had 12 bills this year that came directly from the legislative oversight reports that were enacted and became law, but they would appear first in our report, then a separate group of legislators, and it could be the members of the Legislative Oversight Committee, would sponsor the legislation, and then it would run through the regular course through the other committees.
And one other thing, we're talking not only about oversight by our oversight committees, but oversight by any committee. I mean, I was chairman of the Armed Services Committee for maybe 10 years at the end of my career. We did a lot of oversight. That was a legislative committee doing oversight. And I guess every legislative committee has the power to do oversight. Now, their powers won't be quite the same, maybe in terms of issuing subpoenas and a number of other things. And their jurisdiction would be limited to the area that they're specializing in. But the oversight we're talking about needs to be done in addition to the oversight committees and subcommittees in a bipartisan way, if it's going to be effective, but also by any committee that has jurisdiction over a part of the government has responsibilities to do oversight on what they're responsible for. Now, that may be different in a particular state where they don't do oversight on a separate committee, so I can't speak to that. But in Washington, surely our legislative committees have oversight responsibilities, and if it's done well and done effectively, fact-based and so forth, it obviously can make a huge difference in the area of jurisdiction of that particular committee.
One of the most public aspects of oversight often are the oversight hearings that you would, in both of your roles, would prepare for. Can you speak a little bit about how you prepare for those oversight hearings, the kind of work it takes to get members up to speed such that the work that the staff is doing can actually come through in an hour, 2 hour long hearing? And I know in many of your instances they were quite longer, but the oversight hearings and the work that happened there and how that kind of comes together.
So when we start a agency study, the agency has a 45-day period in which to do a self-analysis of issues that the agency themselves have noted, and we have made our reporting requirements consistent with the executive branch reporting requirements on an annual basis. So we've already been reviewing their own reports that they file. We start staff starts the process of the self-evaluation of the agency. At the same time, the full committee begins to meet with the agency to outline what our expectations are. And after that, there's probably a 60, 90, or 120-day period that goes by that all that information that we've gotten back from the committee, a program evaluation report, an annual restructuring report, reviewing the financial records of the agency and the budget, that staff working with the appropriate subcommittee that is looking at it. In many cases, it's like preparing for either for a deposition or for trial. And you go through and identify what the issues are. But a key component of that, and in the last couple of years with our public input solicitation, we've had 8,000 people respond from all the various counties in South Carolina that would help identify areas that we needed to go ask questions that aren't in any of the documentation, that hadn't been any media accounts of what was going on. And those serve, while it's not offered for the truth of the matter asserted because it's anonymous and it's effectively hearsay, it does help provide a compass for us as to where we need to go to start asking questions. And then from that, we try to break it up into segments because some of the, we had the Department of Public Safety, it was over 450 days that they were involved in the process over 18 months, and a significant number of subcommittee hearings as well as full committee hearings.
Well, the way we did it generally would be the staff jointly would prepare a report for the members. That typically, with our investigations on a permanent subcommittee, would take 6 months to a year or a year and a half. Because the key to good oversight is it's not only got to be fact-based and bipartisan, but it's got to be in-depth. You got to really take the time. If you just see a headline and it strikes your fancy and you got a subpoena issued 3 days later and a hearing 2 weeks later, it may be a good show trial, but that's about it. So ours was in-depth, and this was, I'd say, uniformly in-depth. So time is critical to answer your first question as to how do you prepare. You got to take the time to do it right. And so we're talking millions of documents here sometimes. With computers, as useful as they are, you still got to deal with millions of documents in many of our investigations. And you got to just take the time to learn the subject. For the members, you just have to immerse yourself. It's like, as Representative Newton said, it's like getting ready for a trial or a deposition. You basically, if you're going to have a hearing, should at that moment in time know more about the subject probably than the witness. At least enough to know whether the witness is trying to evade your answers so you can repeat the questions, which I've always found is absolutely essential to a good hearing. If you're going to have witnesses, probably, if you have a good range of witnesses who are going to evade questions. But you got to know enough and take the time to immerse yourself, get into the weeds, as I was often said that I was, sometimes too deep, but to really know the subject well. And it's very typical to a lawyer's responsibility, I agree, going into a hearing. It's only a moment in time. When you know that enough of that information, you're going to not be as much of an expert as the expert in front of you who's trying to avoid the question. But it may just go right through your brain, 2 days later, you don't remember much about it. But it's really important. And the staff has a key role because they got to brief the members. How many members actually will take that time? It depends on the subject. How public that subject is, how momentary it's in the news. But unless the member takes the time to do that, he'll maybe show up and ask a few questions, but it won't make a kind of contribution that you rely on.
And the reports or recommendations that come out of these in-depth reviews and investigations, how hard is it to have that be a unified product that the minority and the majority, the Democrats and Republicans, each party can sign on to and say, yes, I 100% will sign my name to this. I agree that this is a factual statement about the situation that we've just spent time in looking into?
Well, I'd say we probably, maybe 100% of the time or close, we're able to have a bipartisan factual report. There were times, obviously, when the recommendations that flowed from the report, as Representative Newton said, were different. And that's fine if you have different recommendations. Probably 80 or 90% of the time, the recommendations, by the way, were in common. And these are significant recommendations. I mean, on a bipartisan basis, we were able to take on some of the most powerful interests in this country. Some of the most powerful institutions, banks, and other institutions that we did it on a bipartisan basis. There was probably one case that I can remember where we just simply decided we weren't going to make a big public offering or a public presentation of the factual report because there was a minority report which was very different from the majority report. In that one case, I remember kind of vividly. But even then, we worked together. How do we minimize the friction? How do you avoid the report coming out just that members are fighting each other or disagree with each other? How do you avoid that if you have different opinions? And the answer is if you work together to do it right, you can focus on the substance of the different opinions and try to say, hey, we disagree on this, but and then say something positive about the other person who you disagree with. I mean, make it a real effort to, even when there's a disagreement, to make it so civil that even those parts of the media that want to focus on warfare are going to have a a lot of trouble doing it. They're either not going to run the story because it's too boring, but it just won't be a story about, blood all over the floor, because that doesn't do any good for anybody. It just doesn't advance it. So I would say that it is possible. Factually, I don't think we missed. We may have missed once in terms of a joint report on recommendations. Where we missed, and we're just civil about it and presented our different points of view. But an amazing number of times that we were able to come together on the entire report, facts and recommendations, on some very, very tough subjects. I mean, I always remember Senator McCain. He was obviously on torture. He was passionate. So we had a very significant armed services report about the torture that the CIA wasn't within our lane, but we were able to show how some of the armed services defense guys had fed into that unwittingly, but nonetheless had. But it was a report about torture. There can't be a subject that was more heatedly debated during that administration than torture. But we had a report, a joint report on that. Of course, I give Senator McCain credit for making that possible, but he did.
As we go through our process, the recommendations get voted on first by a subcommittee, individually. And then when we get to the full committee and the recommendations of the subcommittee and the overall reports being considered, we'll delay the vote and continue with discussion for as long as any member on the committee wants to ask questions of the agency or of anybody else that is related to the subject matter, so that there's never a suggestion that I didn't agree because I didn't have the opportunity to ask the questions to really get to the facts, or you missed it because. And then our rules provide that there are minority statements that can be attached to the report, not in terms of party, but by individuals. But more often than not, then what it has led is if someone is not comfortable supporting a report and recommendation when it has been presented, we'll give them the opportunity to say, what do you need to answer, to fully educate yourself one way or the other, that you're ready to vote in favor or against. Because again, it goes back to this notion of fairness and our committee process. We don't ever want anybody to suggest that we cut them off, that they had a line of investigation they wanted to pursue. We don't have any time frame other than the state statute that created our effort says we got to look at every state agency in a 7-year recurring cycle. And I hope that doesn't mean that in the last year we've got an awful lot of work to do, but since we started from scratch 4 years ago, we're already a little bit behind the 8 ball.
So I think we have time for some questions for the audience. If I know we have a lot of oversight professionals with opinions in the room to get some of these thoughts. Right here?
Yes,
There's a mic behind you.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Clark, reporter with Government Executive. I was wondering if Senator Levin could talk about how oversight has been done in the past few years under the Republican majority and how it may change.
You want me to be bipartisan and answer that question at the same time? And this is only from kind of from observation from a distance. I do have a brother who's still in the Congress, Senator Levin, who's retiring, and you'll love his son. If you loved him, you'll also love his son, Andy, who was elected to the Congress. But I'm going to stereotype a bit. I think on the Senate side, in the key investigation that has the most visibility that I've seen most of from a distance, on the Russian investigation, it looks as though it's got some real bipartisan depth to it. Whether it ends up that way, there's no way I know. I'm not in touch with the leadership of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. On the House side, from a distance, it looks terrible. It looks political, partisan. It looks like, from my perspective, some of the hearings are just quickly called. They're repeated, like on the Benghazi hearings. I don't know how many Benghazi hearings there were, but it looked totally political, totally partisan in some of those committees on the House side. and I don't, as I mentioned, kind of in a more less specific way before, I don't think they had any particular success. But that's not your question. But they looked, particularly on the House side, extremely partisan and discouraging, by the way. And I think part of the reason that the public is turned off on, to the extent they are, more on democracy, which is a danger to all of us, is because those hearings were appeared to be so partisan on the House side. I think people just sort of threw up their hands. If all they read about is, repetition of what looks like a political hearing, I think it just leads people to believe that, you guys wanted to get your act together, and it's a very negative response in terms of not just on policy, which will vary depending on the party, maybe, of the person responding, but it's very bad for democracy to have an appearance that we can't work together to look at common threats, for God's sake. We can't look at a threat to our elections. I mean, I'm not a particularly observant guy religiously, but this you're talking about basic stuff in a democracy. You can't get much more fundamental than elections. That's kind of our writ, our holy writ. Forgive the reference, but it's for us not to be, for Republicans to look. And here I'm going to be partisan because I'm trying to be factual. To look like trying to be factual, it looks like they're not willing to go after threats to elections just for the fundamental reason we all have the same stake in preserving elections. Everybody in a democracy has the same stake, to preserve the other guy's right to a fair election. So anyway, I think the appearance has been unhappy on the Republican House side.
Thank you.
You're allowed to respond too if you want to.
That was a question about Congress.
I wasn't looking at Representative Newman. I was looking at our moderator. I don't want to put you on the spot.
And I'll just say we'll see how you answer that question come March or April.
Right. It's a fair point. Yeah.
I saw a question over here. Just wait 1 second.
Corbin Heyer from E&E News. Just to follow up on that, you said that that to be effective, oversight needs to be bipartisan. So Democrats are about to take the House. What are the prospects for bipartisanship, and will House oversight be effective given what you've seen during the previous 2 years from Republican oversight?
I hope that Democrats will make every effort to run bipartisan investigations. I have expressed that to some of the people, not my brother. Obviously, I have to him, but he's not going to be there. That to others who are going to be there, that they resist the temptation to respond in kind. It's not effective, and it just damages the democracy. Now, whether they can find a way to do that, I just hope they'll do everything. They'll try as hard as they can. I can personally vouch for being able, with people who you have a very different philosophical perspective from, that if you trust each other, just simple trust each other as legislators, that you can do an awful lot of things together. But that's the key. You don't have to agree with people on fundamental issues. Just make sure that person's going to keep his word, keep confidence, not leak stuff to the press. Forgive me. Not undermine investigations. Find common ground. I guarantee you there are areas that can be investigated, where both Democrats and Republicans ought to be able to come together. Now, elections happen to be one of them, because I feel very passionately about being able to have bipartisan investigations of elections, for heaven's sake. But there are other things that can be investigated and should be.
I think we might have time for one or two more questions. Yeah.
Do we have any questions which won't evoke what appears to be a partisan response?
I don't think mine will, sir. Mine's
That's
actually
okay.
for Representative Newton.
Good,
First.
thank you.
Representative Newton, my name's Irvin McCullough. I work for the Government Accountability Project. We're a nonprofit that represents whistleblowers. I was wondering, on the state level, especially in South Carolina, what role do whistleblowers and sources play in your oversight?
A pretty important role. As I mentioned during my comments, one of the things when we start out with an agency study, we ask the director of the agency under oath to tell us how he is going to encourage all employees within the agency to communicate back to our department or back to the Oversight Committee, and how they have made employees aware of the opportunity to do so. Our focus really is on the employees of the various agencies and the people in the public, the folks that are their clients or customers that are dealing with those agencies, because they're going to be able to tell us what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong based on personal experience. And so it's one of the while I said public input is sort of the cornerstone in the way that our process was set up, though employee participation and the solicitation is every bit one of the tenets of public participation. And they're allowed to do it anonymously. I will tell you that we've had some that said, I can't, it's not going to be able to be done anonymously because everybody's going to know who I am. And they came in and we explained to them that you have to testify under oath, but that, obviously everybody's going to know who you are and what you're there to say. But members of the committee then looked to the agency director and said, I plan to keep in touch with you over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 2 years till this employee reaches their retirement age to make sure that there's been no retaliation for what they've done. And we actually put a finding in the report that the agency, as it relates to those employees that had come forward and blown the whistle on what they were doing, that they reported to us on their status over that next cycle coming up so that those employees were protected.
Well, thank you. I think that's all the time we have. I want to thank you guys both very, very much for your time. The work is very important. I know everyone here agrees with that. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists for that insightful discussion.